There's a plant growing in the Andes right now that no farmer planted. It emerged from the same ground it has emerged from for 8,000 years. It needs no irrigation, no fertilizer, no pesticide, no human hand to guide it upward. It simply grows. And when the harvest comes, what is left in the soil will grow again, and again, and again. You have never heard of it. That is not an accident. The modern food system does not have a category for something it cannot sell twice, for something that returns without being asked, for something that feeds a village without requiring a contract, a distributor, a brand, or a bag printed in 3 languages. What cannot be owned cannot survive, not in this world, not in this century. And yet, it persists. This is Ancient Food Files, a place where things that have been buried are brought back to the surface, not as nostalgia, not as fantasy, but as record. Because some things were erased not because they failed, but because they succeeded too completely. If you are someone who believes that the most important knowledge is often the knowledge we are no longer taught, consider subscribing. This archive exists for you. Now, open the record. High in the Andes, above the tree line, where the air is thin and the frost arrives without warning, the Quechua people cultivated a plant they called isanyo. In Aymara, it was known as añu. Both names carry within them the implication of endurance, of survival without dependence. Mashua, Tropiolum tuberosum. It grows between 3,000 and 4,000 meters above sea level, in rocky, shallow, poorly nourished soils that would defeat almost any other crop on Earth. Its vines twist outward, low to the ground, bearing leaves shaped like small shields. When it flowers, the blooms are orange-red, vivid against the gray altitude, startling, almost defiant. But the real story is underground, the tuber, knobbled, dense, cream or purple or yellow depending on variety, some striped with deep burgundy like something painted rather than grown. It stores well, it travels, it feeds. Andean oral tradition did not treat mashua as simply food. Inca records, preserved in knotted cord memory systems known as quipu, indicate that mashua was cultivated alongside potato and oca as part of a triadic food security strategy. When one failed, another endured. The system was not fragile. It was designed for collapse. There is a saying that has traveled across generations of Andean farmers, imprecisely translated but carrying its original weight. The poor man does not starve if the añu still grows. It was never metaphor. It was instruction. To understand why mashua was so difficult to erase and why it has never fully disappeared, you must understand what it is biologically. Mashua is a perennial in its native highlands. It returns from its own root structure year after year without replanting, without intervention. The tubers left in the ground after harvest become the seed stock for the following season. The plant does not wait for permission. It simply continues. It produces its own natural pest deterrents. The glucosinolates and isothiocyanates within its tissue repel nematodes, insects, and fungal pathogens. This is not a trait bred into it by modern science. It evolved this way. Over millennia of altitude, frost, and exposure, mashua became, in effect, its own pesticide. Nematode infestations that devastate conventional potato crops leave mashua largely untouched. Farmers in the Andes have long planted mashua at field borders as a living barrier, a chemical perimeter that costs nothing. Its nitrogen requirements are minimal. It does not exhaust the soil. In fact, some traditional agricultural systems used mashua as a restorative crop, planted after more demanding varieties to allow the earth to recover. It is, in the vocabulary of industrial agriculture, ungovernable. It gives too freely. It requires too little. The historical record is not vague on this point. During the collapse of regional food networks in the Andean highlands in the 16th and 17th centuries, as Spanish colonization disrupted agricultural labor systems, redirected resources, and dismantled the Ayllu community structures that managed collective planting, mashua continued to feed people. The Spanish colonial chronicler Pedro de Cieza de León, writing in the 1550s, documented the tubers of the highland region with a kind of bewildered respect. He noted that the indigenous populations survived on foods that seemed to require almost nothing from the land. He didn't entirely understand what he was observing, but he wrote it down. During the Great Famines of the 1780s, following the Tupac Amaru II rebellion and the brutal colonial suppression that followed, highland communities that maintained traditional polyculture systems, including Mashua, survived at higher rates than those whose agricultural practices had been replaced or disrupted. The 20th century confirmed this pattern again. In regions of Bolivia and Peru affected by drought cycles in the 1980s, ethnobotanical surveys found Mashua persisting in smallholder fields where introduced monocultures had failed entirely. It was never glamorous, it was never celebrated, it simply fed people when nothing else would. Ask why Mashua disappeared from the most world's knowledge, and the answer will take you not to a single decision, but to a logic. Mashua is unmanageable. It cannot be easily standardized. Its tubers vary in shape, color, and size. Its flavor, raw, is sharp, peppery, slightly bitter, and unfamiliar to palates conditioned by sweeter commercial varieties. The Spanish colonial administration, which imposed European agricultural preferences across the Andes, found Mashua inconvenient. It did not resemble the crops they understood. It did not behave like something that could be taxed at a uniform rate, stored in colonial warehouses, or exported with consistent quality grading. Later, in the 20th century, the Green Revolution arrived with the same institutional logic: hybrid seeds, controlled inputs, measurable yields per standardized hectare. Mashua offered none of these assurances. It could not be patented. It reproduced itself. It competed with nothing because it asked for nothing, and that made it invisible to a system that required dependency in order to function. There is also something stranger, something that was used against it. Inca historical sources and later ethnographic records note that Mashua was associated with the suppression of sexual desire. Soldiers during long campaigns were reportedly fed Mashua in quantity, specifically to reduce libidinal distraction. Whether this is entirely pharmacologically accurate remains debated, but the association became cultural. Mashua became a food that diminished vitality, a food for abstinence, a food for the powerless. Slowly, quietly, it became food that no one with choice would choose to eat. The modern researchers who eventually turned their attention to Mashua found something the traditional farmers had always known. Nutritional analyses conducted in the 1990s and 2000s by teams at the International Potato Center in Lima, Peru, and later by researchers at Peruvian universities, confirmed that Mashua tubers contain significant concentrations of vitamin C, iron, and anthocyanins. The darker pigmented varieties carry antioxidant profiles comparable to blueberries. The glucosinosolates that repel pests in the field have been studied for potential anti-carcinogenic properties in human tissue. Preliminary findings, carefully qualified, but present. Studies in soil ecology confirmed that Mashua's alleliopathic compounds, the same chemicals that deter nematodes, contribute to soil microbiome balance when the plant is grown in rotation. The ancient practice of using Mashua as a border crop was not superstition, it was applied biochemistry, arrived at through thousands of years of observation. A 2004 ethnobotanical review published in the journal Economic Botany noted that Mashua remained one of the least studied Andean tubers, despite its clear agronomic advantages. The authors described it as underutilized. The word is precise, but insufficient. It was not simply unused, it was actively left behind. Food carries memory, and sometimes the memory is not hunger, but shame. In much of Latin America, the foods that sustained colonized and enslaved populations through the worst centuries became associated with poverty so completely that the foods themselves became markers of that poverty. To eat them was to announce your station. To feed them to your children was, in some communities, to confess your failure. This is how knowledge dies, not in fire, in embarrassment. in the quiet decision of a parent who wants something better for their children than what themselves endured. The world's topsoil is disappearing. Industrial monoculture has depleted approximately 1/3 of the Earth's arable land in the past century. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizers have created dead zones in coastal waters and altered soil microbiomes in ways still being measured. Global freshwater reserves for irrigation are contracting. The climate is shifting the growing seasons of every major agricultural zone on Earth. Into this context, consider mashua again, a crop that grows in thin, rocky, frost-prone soil that requires no synthetic input, that repels its own pests, that renews itself annually from its own root structure, that produces a nutritionally dense tuber in conditions where almost nothing else survives. And that has done this reliably for 8,000 years. It does not require saving,